week I've thought a lot and prayed a lot, and a lot of things happen during the week. And I don't know, I'm affected by, events in the world. And I think most of us are. We are very worldly people, having been with true parents. I mean, he carried us from, through a whole religion. And when you study and learn the divine principle, you're learning about the whole Bible, the whole history of Israel. You're learning about the entire history of the Western world, at least Christianity. You learn about current events, and we were all part of the 20th century. And we were involved and actively, aggressively working, supporting our true parents to accomplish certain goals during the course of not only his lifetime, but our lifetime, our lives, from a young age until now, when we're older people. We're not the oldest, but we're older, so our minds and our thinking is different than average people, for sure. But I want to talk about something very fundamental and something very basic, and that is about the fall. And because without understanding, really clearly understanding, what the fall was and what original sin is, we can't fully comprehend and understand who true parents are. We don't really understand even the meaning of religion in general without understanding the fall. And certainly, we won't be able to cope with events, sometimes events that go on around us that seem so fallen and so unprincipled and so evil. And I want to get right into it. I have very specific points that I want to make, and I hope and pray that they'll be useful. I know that they were kind of a revelation for me this week. First, I want to explain most of what I'm going to have on the board is directly from the Divine Principle book. Okay, not just Reverend Moon's speeches, but the official Divine Principle book. And that is really, in my opinion and my understanding, the essence of what true parents have left for mankind. Mankind's, the gift from God to fallen mankind, the greatest gift that God could ever give is actually the Divine Principle. Of course, the life, as I'll explain, the life of our true parents and what they did in relationship to the Divine Principle is also equally important, but at least we need to understand this explanation is so profound. So let's get right into talking about the fall. God created the angelic world and assigned Lucifer to the position of an archangel. Lucifer was the channel of God's love to the angelic world, just as Abraham was the channel of God's blessing to the Israelites. In this position, he virtually monopolized the love of God. However, after God created human beings as his children, he loved them many times more than he had ever loved Lucifer, whom he had created as his servant. In truth, God's love toward Lucifer did not change. It was the same before and after the creation of human beings. Yet when Lucifer saw that God loved Adam and Eve more than him, he felt as if there had been a decrease in the love he received from God. One of the things the Divine Principle does is it talks about a very interesting story. The story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Okay? It's almost a fairy tale. I don't even know, having not been in the loop of Christianity for 40 years, I don't even know if Christian people even talk much about this story anymore. But the fact of the matter is that story was put in that scripture by some divine revelation from God for a very significant reason and purpose. And it teaches us a very real event. And only through the divine principle did we come to understand the significance of this particular story. There are 4 characters that are involved in this story. God, Adam, who is the first created son of God, Eve, who is the first created daughter of God, and an angelic being, an angel, whom we call Lucifer. And their relationship with each other at this very key moment in God's creation was what would determine whether whether the first ancestors were able to grow and reach and fulfill their purpose of creation. And as we know from this story, they failed to fulfill their purpose of creation, and instead created fallen nature, and the archangel Lucifer became Satan, as we're going to talk about. This situation is similar in that in the Bible parable of the laborers in the vineyard. Although the laborers who had worked since morning received a fair wage, when they saw that those who came later and worked less received just as much, they felt underpaid. Lucifer, feeling as though he were receiving less love than he deserved, wanted to grasp the same central position in human society as he enjoyed in the angelic world, as the channel of God's love. This was why he seduced Eve, and this was the motivation of the spiritual fall. Everything in the universe is created to be governed by God through love. Thus, love is the source of life, the key to happiness, and the essence of the ideal to which all beings aspire. The more one receives love, the more beautiful one appears to others. When the angel, created as God's servant, beheld Eve, the daughter of God, it was only natural that she looked beautiful in his eyes. Moreover, when Lucifer saw that Eve was responding to his temptation, the angel felt the stimulation of her love to be deliciously enticing. At this point, Lucifer was seducing Eve with the mind to have her regardless of the consequences. Lucifer, who left his proper position due to his excessive desire, and Eve, who wanted to open her eyes and become like God before the time was right, formed a common base and began give-and-take action. The power of the unprincipled love generated by their give-and-take led them to consummate an illicit sexual relationship on the spiritual plane. This angelic being began to conceptualize that things weren't like he originally thought they were going to be. He had been the only being, really, in God's creation, in the angelic world. He was the central being of the angelic world, receiving so much love and attention. And God used the angelic world in helping him to understand and formulate ideas of how to create the physical world. So the physical world mirrors the spiritual world. God, in the beginning of Genesis, said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Who was he talking to? Before he created Adam and Eve, who could he possibly be talking to? Himself? He was talking to the angels, because he had already created angels with a form with a head and arms and legs, and they existed in a spiritual plane, in a spiritual world. So God was using the angelic world. So now God creates human beings, the first ancestors. And the angel feels something. He feels, God isn't loving me as much, or whatever. And God knows that Adam and Eve are growing, and they're starting to experience desires, unlike any that have ever been experienced before. Sexual desires. Adam and Eve are destined to become sexually aware, and eventually God knows they're going to they're going to have a relationship with each other. And that's all part of God's plan of creation. But now this angelic being is becoming involved and aggressively trying to now take a position away from Eve and Adam. All beings are created based on the principle that when they become one in love, they exchange elements with each other. Accordingly, when Eve became one with Lucifer through love, she received certain elements from him. First, she received feelings of dread arising from the pangs of a guilty conscience, stemming from her violation of the purpose of creation. Second, she received from Lucifer the wisdom which enabled her to discern that her original intended spouse was to be Adam, not the angel. Then, the same thing happened between fallen Eve and Adam. And, as a result, the archangel, fallen Eve, and fallen Adam separated from God. They misused their relationship and they fell. So after the fall, the archangel became Satan. Eve became fallen Eve. Adam became fallen Adam, and they created the fallen nature. The fallen nature is that we have the tendency to repeat the same pattern, the same way of behaving. We start to think like the archangel. We start to think like fallen Eve. We start to think like fallen Adam. We start to behave like they behaved. They created this original sin, and we inherited that way of thinking, that way of feeling, that way of behaving. That's one of the central points of the principle. So failing to make a relationship with God and understanding God's point of view, leaving our own, not understanding our own value, not realizing that I am the son of God, or my wife is the daughter of God. Having that sense of value, that sense of significance and purpose, and then not understanding my own value, I try to take value from someone else, thereby destroying their position. You know, the archangel didn't keep his position as an angelic being, and he tried to take Adam and Eve's position as sons and daughters of God. And then we multiply sin. So fallen nature was the result of this original sin. The divine principle, in one sentence, says that sin is a violation of heavenly law, which is committed when a person forms a common base with Satan, thus setting a condition for give and take action with him. There are two parts. Violating heavenly law is when you act according to your fallen nature. But the second part is making a relationship with this spiritual being we call Satan. If Satan doesn't exist, then sin will not exist anymore. So the archangel becoming Satan is the other result of the original sin. Both of these are very significant and important to understand. Satan is the name given to the archangel Lucifer after he fell. When the first human ancestors fell, they bound themselves in blood ties with Lucifer. They formed a four-position foundation yoked to Satan, and thus all humanity became the children of Satan. This is why Jesus said to the people, "You are of your father the devil," and called them a brood of vipers. And St. Paul wrote, "Not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruit of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait for adoption as sons. We wait for the redemption of our bodies," indicating that no one belongs to the lineage of God. Instead, due to the fall of the first human ancestors, human beings are of the lineage of Satan. That's not exactly the same thing as having fallen nature. What this means is ownership, authority over mankind. Not only did we inherit a behavior that is against God's principles, but we're not even owned by God anymore. God can't directly claim us as his sons and daughters. Not only because of the way we behave, but because of the position of this angelic being having this dominion over fallen mankind. And all from the beginning of time until now, no one, absolutely no one, understood this real situation of humanity. Satan is constantly accusing all people before God, as he did Job, in order to drag them into hell. However, even Satan cannot perpetrate his evil activity unless he first finds an object partner with whom he can form a common base and engage in give and take action. Satan's object partners are evil spirits in the spirit world. The object partners to these evil spirits are the spirit selves of evil people on earth. And the vehicles through which these evil spirit selves act are their physical selves. Accordingly, the power of Satan is conveyed through evil spirits and is manifested in the activities of earthly people. Since Satan is constantly accusing all people before God, what does it really mean to accuse? Satan is saying, look, those people are being unprincipled. They are unprincipled, like I am unprincipled. Therefore, they belong to me. I own them. They are not your children, they are my children. See, look at how they're behaving. That's accusing. Accusing before God. Pointing the finger. Emphasizing the bad, the evil, the broken. But the amazing thing about this is that all of that fallen nature, all of that way of behaving is instigated and promoted by Satan. So Satan is trying to get people to feel distant from God because of the way they behave, but they are behaving the same way Satan is behaving. So whose fault is it? Whose responsibility is it? Whose problem is it that people are behaving that way? Satan did that. We have a saying, the pot calling the kettle black, right? We're pointing the finger and accusing someone of doing something wrong. Even Jesus addressed it. He said, before you accuse someone else about the speck in their eye, you should remove the mote, the log that's in your own eye. He was making reference to this whole idea of accusing. When we go down the road of accusing other people, pointing the finger, oh, you're this, you're that, then we are multiplying the fallen nature. And we are promoting the satanic view. So the reason why Satan was able to get away with this all this time is because no one understood that this being whom we call Satan was originally an angel that was designed and created by God for a good purpose, and that he fell. Once we can identify who Satan is, then we can begin to say, wait a minute, who are you to accuse me of making these mistakes when you have been doing exactly the same thing for tens of thousands of years? You're more evil than I am. You're even the source of evil. Pointing the finger, accusing Satan, instead of letting Satan accuse us. No one could do that. Even Jesus wasn't able to do that. He couldn't teach people to do that directly. Why? Because the identity of Satan was hidden. Only one person in all of history ever discovered clearly the real identity of the archangel Lucifer, who became Satan. Not, you won't learn it in seminaries, you won't learn it in the Quran, you won't learn it in the Bible, you won't learn it in the Buddha won't teach it to you. Atheists aren't going to teach it to you. No one can teach it. No one can understand it. No one can explain it. Only one person discovered this reality. That was our true parents, our true Father. And that was the difference. It's the difference between heaven and hell. It's the way of true salvation. The beginning of the end of evil and sin, and the beginning of the kingdom of heaven on earth started with that one discovery, that one deep understanding of who exactly Satan was. The kingdom of heaven on earth is a restored world in which Satan can no longer instigate any activity. To realize this world, it is necessary for all humanity to eliminate their common base with Satan, restore their common base with God, and engage in give-and-take action with Him. The prophecy that in the last days God will confine Satan in a bottomless pit signifies that Satan will be utterly incapable of any activity, since there will no longer be any counterpart with whom Satan can relate. In order to eliminate our common base with Satan and be capable of judging him, we must understand the identity and crime of Satan and accuse him before God. Turn. Say, wait a minute. Who do you think you are to point the finger at us when you have done this? That's the beginning. But even more amazing than that is Father discovered that not only are we meant to be able to stand up against Satan, but Father had to actually not only accuse Satan, but change Satan's mind. Allow Satan to be able to face himself and change to go back to becoming the archangel that he originally was created to be. So it's not just, one-upmanship, getting I'm stronger than you, I'm more powerful than you, I'll defeat you, I'll destroy you. That isn't the way true Father ultimately dealt with Satan. The ultimate way that Father dealt with Satan was to sacrifice so much and to love so much that even this being that had spent his entire existence leading people to destruction was able to eventually accept the fact, my way isn't going to work. You're right. I'm not happy. I don't want this. Is there any way for me to change? Is there any way for me to be forgiven? Father did that. He won in prison, in Hung Nong prison. He changed the hearts of people that hated him so much because of his unconditional love and his understanding, his realization, his recognition of who Satan really was. And instead of blaming God and accusing God and criticizing and complaining to God, the world is such a terrible place, and he really focused in on Satan and challenged and eventually defeated Satan. However, God endowed human beings and angels with freedom. Therefore, he cannot restore them by force. Of their own free will, human beings are to bring Satan to voluntary submission by upholding the Word of God through fulfilling their responsibility. Only in this way can we be restored to the original ideal purpose by God at the creation. Because God works his providence based on this principle, the history of the providence of restoration has been repeatedly prolonged. Never by force, never by intimidation, never by aggression, never by trickery, manipulation of knowledge, lying, stealing, twisting. Never. Only by true love will people's minds and hearts ultimately be willing to change their direction. So we are separated from God for two primary reasons. We inherited the fallen nature, and we belong to the lineage of Satan. So the Messiah comes for two primary reasons: to teach us to live according to our original nature, and to return us to the lineage of God. So, understanding and explaining good and evil. The divine principle explains an act or the result of an act is considered good when it fulfills God's purpose of creation. This takes place when a subject partner and object partner unite through the harmonious and spirited give and take of love and beauty, become the third object partner to God, and form the four-position foundation. On the other hand, an act or its result is called evil when it violates God's purpose of creation by forming a four-position foundation under the dominion of Satan. Violating the purpose of creation, being under the dominion of Satan. Those are the two things that define something as being evil. Doing anything that supports or encourages or helps people to fulfill the purpose of creation is good. But the actions of good and evil in this process of the history of restoration through indemnity are not easily recognized. So good and evil is not easily recognized in the beginning. So having already defined good and evil, let us further examine the nature of good and evil from the viewpoint of purpose. Had Adam and Eve loved each other as God intended and formed a four-position foundation centered on God, they would have established a good world. But when they loved each other with a purpose contrary to God's intention and established a four-position foundation centered on Satan, they ended up forming an evil world. This demonstrates that although good and evil elements or actions may take the same form, their true nature may be discerned through their fruits. They yield their fruits in accordance with the divergent purposes they pursue. We find many cases where an aspect of human nature, conventionally considered evil, is in fact good if its purpose is directed toward the will of God. Let us take the example of desire. Talking about desire. You know, if you study Buddhism, Buddhism teaches you to basically deny desire. It doesn't identify that desire is good or evil. In fact, the purpose is to teach us that desire isn't good or evil, which in a sense is true. The direction that desire takes us determines whether the desire is a good desire or an evil desire. But desire in and of itself, having a desire to have more love, having a desire to want to have a sexual relationship, having a desire to eat when you're hungry, seeing a beautiful car, someone else is driving down the road and having the desire to want to have that car so that you can drive it, so that you can be in it. There's nothing evil about that. We explain, desire, which people often consider sinful, is actually God-given. Joy is the purpose of creation. Joy, joy, joy. Joy is the purpose of our lives. If we have no desire, we could never experience joy. If we had no desire, we would not have any aspirations to receive God's love, to live, to perform good deeds, or to improve ourselves. Without desire, therefore, neither God's purpose of creation nor the providence of restoration could be fulfilled. An orderly, harmonious, and flourishing human society would be impossible. Desires are necessary, important. Desire, being part of our God-given natures, are good when they bear fruit for the purpose of God's will, or are evil when they bear fruit for the purpose of Satan's will. On this basis, we can deduce that even this evil world will be restored to goodness and become the kingdom of heaven on earth if it changes its direction and purpose according to the guidance of Christ. The guidance of Christ. The guidance of the true parents, according to the divine principle. Only the divine principle will ultimately reveal the truth to people that will allow them to change their direction and recognize this action is not good. This action isn't going to help me, it's not going to help other people, and ultimately it's going to lead me into destruction. Only through the divine principle can we clearly identify the purpose of creation. Any standard of goodness set during the course of the providence of restoration is not absolute but relative. The standard of goodness during the course of restoration is not absolute. In any particular period of history, obedient compliance with the doctrines expounded by the prevailing authorities is considered good, while actions in opposition to them are considered evil. There was a time, not too many years ago, slavery was considered good. If you opposed slavery, you were considered evil by the authorities. It was in the law. There are so many examples of good and evil being determined not by the absolute standard, but by a temporary standard. And we have to recognize and accept that reality. However, the change of an era ushers in new authorities and doctrines with new goals and new standards of good and evil. For the adherents of any religious tradition or school of thought, complying with the precepts of its doctrine or philosophy is good, while opposing them is evil. But whenever a doctrine or philosophy undergoes a change, its standards of good and evil will also change according to its new goals. Similarly, if an adherent converts to a different religion or school of thought, then naturally his goals and standards of good and evil will change accordingly. What's happening in the world today? People are still clinging to old standards and old traditions, old doctrines. And at a time, those doctrines were good. They were good. Some of them were good. They actually brought people from down here up to here. And God, at some times in history, even encouraged people to become members or to become part of that way of thinking, of that religion. Religion ultimately was for God's purpose of restoration. But then, when a new thought philosophy or the new teaching comes, the old standards are not necessarily good anymore. They can become a fetter. That's a word that Marxists used. A wall to prevent people from going further, reaching higher, not settling for just good, but achieving that which is complete and great. I've often used the example of construction, being on a construction site. Our lives here, if you ever have built anything, especially if you've ever worked to build a home, you realize that the process of constructing, of building, of creating is a very messy process. And at any given time, you might actually find yourself destroying things. Many times I worked, not many times I worked, but I have had the experience of working construction. Before I joined the church, and even after joining the church, I had some brother came here in North Carolina. He had this really big idea about starting his own little construction company. So I started working with him, building houses. And while you're building the houses, you're building frames and getting everything ready for the windows they're going to come in. And sometimes you build it wrong. You get it wrong the first time. And then you take this thing, it's called a Sawzall. And all it is just it's a blade attached to a motor. And you plug it in and you just go in and you just destroy everything that you just built. You wipe it out. And then you have to build it all again. And it takes extra time and effort, energy, whatever. That's it. That's the process. And sometimes you frame the whole house, and the inspector comes in and he says, "Oh, I'm sorry, but this isn't code." And then you got to go back, and then someone's got to come in. They got to maybe dig into the concrete and take out more. It's messy. And during that time, the wind is coming, the rain's coming, things are destroyed. It's ugly. Who would want to live here? Nobody would want to live in any of these places, when they're being under construction. So what happens if you, in the middle of the construction, you go in with a standard of absolute beauty and goodness, and what are you doing? This house is a mess. Get out of here. It's not finished yet. Don't complain about it. This is the only way. It's messy. It's not clean to build. That is the history of restoration through indemnity. Our lives were messy. Everyone's lives were messy. It's a mess. Your relationships break. Sometimes there's divorce. Sometimes you lose your children. People get hurt. It's difficult. There can be a lot of, having to go back and try again and try again and try again. But that's God's providence. And when true parents first came, that's what they went through. That's what the history of restoration, the 20th century, was all about. This very difficult, messy process of restoration through indemnity. And it wasn't beautiful. And even, it isn't finished yet, quite. Some aspect of it is finished, but it's up to us to complete it. It's up to us to have the right heart, the right attitude. Conflicts and revolutions constantly plague human society, mainly because of the continual changes in standards of good and evil as people seek to fulfill divergent purposes. Yet, throughout the endless cycles of conflict and revolution in human history, people have been seeking the absolute goodness which their original mind desires. Everyone has an original mind of goodness. Ultimately, every single person, even the people that seem to be the most lost. Buried beneath all that doctrine and all that false understanding and that wrong life and that pain and suffering that they went through is that original desire to be a good person and to find true joy and true happiness. Conflicts and revolutions in fallen human society will inevitably continue as people pursue this absolute goal until the final achievement of the world of goodness. The standard of goodness will remain relative only as long as the course of restoration continues. Once the sovereignty of Satan is expelled from the earth, then God, the eternal and absolute being, transcendent of time and space, will establish His sovereignty and His truth. In that day, God's truth will be absolute, and hence the purpose which it serves and the standard of goodness which it sets will both be absolute. This cosmic, all-encompassing truth will be firmly established by Christ at His second advent. This is where we're at. True parents, without us being aware of it, without most of fallen mankind knowing it, they firmly established the standard of true love. It is here. We inherited it. We inherited it, and we don't even know it. We're constantly going back to our old ways of thinking to such an extent that we still don't even know if we're really saved or not. And how many times have I gone into a Christian church for the purpose of witnessing, and I've walked the walk down to the front, and I've accepted Christ as my personal Lord and Savior. I did that when I was 16 years old, and I believe in it. I believe there's a power to doing that. It's a condition. It's a real condition. It was a standard that was established by God through Christianity. Accept Christ. Believe. Trust. Christ is coming. But the definition of sin for most Christian people is so vague, so difficult to pinpoint. Because in the Christian idea, people who did nothing wrong, except they didn't accept Christ as their personal Lord and Savior. But even if you lived your entire life as a decent person, they say, oh no, you can't go to heaven that way. You can't go to heaven by your good actions. Only if you accept Christ. So our subconscious wrestles and struggles with this kind of concept. Innocent children going to hell forever simply because they don't accept Christ on these terms? Is that really the definition of sin? And then people can do anything they want, but if they accept Christ at the end of their lives, all their sins are forgiven. They have no responsibility anymore for their actions. That's not the reality. In the spiritual world, that is certainly not the reality. And in fact, Jesus didn't even teach that. Jesus taught people to be responsible for their lives. There's no doubt about that. And I'm not going to go into a bunch of Bible quotes and Bible stories, but clearly, Jesus said it's not those that say, Lord, Lord, but those that do the will of the Father. He said, in that day, many will come to me and say, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name? Didn't we cast out demons in your name? Didn't we do many mighty works in your name? And I will say to them, depart from me, you evildoers. I never knew you. Only the divine principle explained clearly the sin. And guess what? We're not sinners anymore. Oh, we might make mistakes. We might break things. Unfortunately, sometimes the things we break are each other's hearts or spirits. We treat each other poorly. We don't perfectly raise our children, or we're not perfect husbands and wives, etc., etc. That by itself is not a sin. It's a problem. It's an issue you have to deal with. Why? Because we want to love each other. We want to get along with each other. We want to create an environment where we all have joy and peace and freedom and happiness. So if I do hurt your feelings, if I do say something wrong, if I do behave in an unprincipled way, I am responsible for that. I'm responsible to you for that. because I hurt you. We're responsible to each other because we're part of one family. In that sense, yeah, we have to be principled people. But the original sin, the existence of a satanic being that is able to unleash his authority and undermine everything that God tries to do, is no longer in play. Satan has been defeated. What remains is the stubbornness or the unwillingness or the simple ignorance of people to be aware that there is this standard now. There is the standard. God has established a standard of absolute love. So my responsibility, your responsibility, our responsibility is to do our best to embody that standard of love. To be that bright, shining person. When people are complaining or angry or resentful, or even if they're doing hateful or evil things around us, we have to keep the standard of goodness and not let go of our confidence that the way of true love will prevail. The way of true love is going to save the world. People are going to change. People are changing. There's more good out there than there is evil. You have to believe that. It's absolutely true. You know, the media and, you know, the news and things, you can't get it all. You can learn some things. You can find out some basic, you know, like skeletal things through the media. But the whole story, the deeper reality of what's going on in the minds and the hearts of people, trust God. God is going to establish his sovereignty. Not me, not you, not true father, not true mother, not the true children, you know, not the Christians, not the Buddhists, not the Muslims. God. God is very unique and very different. God is not a person like you or me. He doesn't have a form like you or I. And yet, he has an incredible personality. He is real. He is the designer and creator of the universe. Brilliant, beyond imagination. Artistic, beyond understanding. More compassionate, more caring than anything we can even imagine. God is the eternal parent of mankind. God is able to work in people's minds and people's hearts. We simply have to, from the outside, we can only approach people from the outside. You know, especially while we're alive on this earthly plane, we're just material beings, you know. We're limited. I have a physical body and, you know, I can only be in so many places at once. I forgot how many, I can be in 3 or 4 places at once. No, people talk about multitasking. I kind of don't really believe people aren't designed to multitask, actually. You know, Father multitasked, but he did it out of necessity. You know, we do, a lot of times we do a lot of different things out of necessity. But, you know, you're meant to, you know, if there's something that you like, you're meant to focus on that and to enjoy that and to delve into it and to experience it fully and completely. You know, if you're an artist, you're meant to, you know, surround yourself with art. You don't just, oh, I'm an artist, I just do art a little bit and now I've got to do something else. The point I'm making is God is real. God is our eternal parent. And God has the authority and the dominion now. True parents gave it over to them, to him, them, parents, whatever. God is real. And we have to be confident, absolutely sure that God is working. So whatever the news might be, whatever the its external situation might appear to be. God has done it, established the standard. And the standard is the divine principle. The divine principle explains it clearly. So sometimes you might not be able to verbally tell the divine principle to someone, but become their friend. You know, be a friend. Do things with other people. Share your life with other people. And in doing so, just incidentally sometimes tell them, oh yeah, I was with Reverend Moon. You've heard of him? Oh, you know how I met my wife? You know how I met my husband? That's one of the best ways to witness. Whenever I tell the story of how I met my wife or how we were married at Madison Square Garden, really? Wow, really? You know, to strangers. And that, wow, and it differentiates you from normal people. And of course, obviously. And this is a good thing, because we're not normal people. You know, we're not normal people. We're not of the world anymore. We're different. And believe me, you can be sure that spiritually, inside people's minds, something is going on. We have power, you know, given to us by God and true parents. So let us be absolutely clear. You know, the principle is true. The fall took place. Satan existed. Satan was real. Evil was real. You know, it's interesting to me, you know, I'm not going to mention any names because people are sick of hearing it, but some people, they even become atheists because of the reality of evil. You know, evil is such a real thing that people have to deal with. And it so contradicts. It so completely 180 degrees contradicts the very ideal of the kingdom of heaven that religious people preach, that it's been such a mystery, such a difficult thing to deal with, the concept of evil and good. But here, it's explained to us. You know, God has taught it to us through our true parents. Through our parents, we have learned the correct standard of true love. And we can be confident now, absolutely confident now. And that's our responsibility, you know, to be clear, to be confident, to not waffle. So, you know, if someone comes up to me and asks me, are you saved? You know, did you accept Jesus? And, no, I'm going to start being very, I accepted Jesus, you know, a long time ago. But I'm actually really saved because I actually understand very clearly the nature of Satan and how Satan has worked. And I learned from someone who discovered this himself. Do you want to hear about it? Do you want to get rid of Satan completely? Because Christians are waiting for Jesus to come. They're waiting for Jesus to come because they know, you know, we're all still sinners. We're all sinners. Still. That's how they witness to people. You're a sinner. You've got to accept Jesus Christ. And it's true, people are still sinning. But what is the real solution? There's a solution now. Anyway, the houses have been built. You know, we are the house. We are meant to be the people that other people want to become like. That's who we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be a beautiful home. When people look at us or they see us or they interact with us, they're supposed to think, oh man, I wish I could deal with these things like you do. I wish I had that kind of confidence. I wish I, you know, had that kind of relationship with my children, whatever. That's what we're supposed to be. But we can't do it for them. People have to ultimately, you know, people have to build their own house, live in their own home. You know, people have to deal with their own issues. But at least we have to remain clear and strong. So true parents taught us. He gave us the word, explained clearly the divine principle, and then solved the problem of original sin, defeated Satan, and made the condition through all these blessed couples. This made the condition. And each of these couples is an individual son or daughter of God. And each of us is meant to ultimately be that example and that standard for others to look up to. That's our mission. That's our responsibility as children of true parents. So be bold and be confident and don't be afraid. You know, you're going to make mistakes. You know, we're all works in progress. But we don't have the original sin anymore. We aren't sinners like the people from the past. Just because, you know, you're limited in your capacity to love, that doesn't make you're not dominated by Satan anymore. Let's pray. I'd like to offer a short prayer and then we'll pray in unison. Our Heavenly Parent, I know these words are really true, that the divine principle has explained to us very clearly and very precisely the original sin and the origin of evil, and defines and explains good and evil from the viewpoint of the purpose of creation. And through the principle of creation, we can understand we were meant to each individually grow up and become a son or daughter of yours. And then we're meant to become a husband and a wife and be responsible to create a family, to have children, and to raise those children and be responsible for those children and to help those children to grow up and become good people, citizens of the kingdom of heaven. And ultimately, we also should love and respect and honor the creation and this life that you gave to us in this earthly plane. But our destiny, our ultimate destiny, is to live eternally with you in an eternal world, a spiritual world. Let us not forget that reality also. But in the meantime, help us to grow. Help us to become your true sons and your true daughters. Each one of us here is no greater or no lesser than any of the rest of us. We are all your son or your daughter. Some of us have particular quirky personalities, or we've come from a background that was especially difficult on us spiritually or physically. And so it's not easy for us to love and forgive and unite. But our true parents set the example and the standard. And despite the diversity and the chaos and the confusion of this long history of restoration through indemnity, they persevered and had faith and hope and trust and held on to you as the eternal parent of mankind and embodied your true love and have shared that true love with all of us. Help us to share it with each other and with people around us. We thank you for your blessings, and we offer our prayers to you now and report these things as Blessed Central families. And in my name, John Pace with Sharon Pace, Blessed Central family. Adieu.